Good morning, Nick.
Morning, Matt. Good to see you.
Good to see you. All right, so today we are going to discuss a book that came out in 23 called TomorrowMind. The full title is TomorrowMind, Thriving at Work with Resilience, Creativity, and Connection, Now and in an Uncertain Future, which was appropriate in 2023 and even more so today. There's how many articles talking about how AI is going to affect our work or even maybe substitute you or replace you at work. So the book is by Gabriella, Rosen, Kellerman, and Martin Seligman. Now, Martin Seligman is one of the founders of positive psychology, which we can discuss a little bit later. But Gabriella Kellerman is medical doctor, and she is with a group called Better. Hang on one second. It's called Better Up Labs, and she is I actually have this up here if I can find it. She is the Chief Innovation Officer there, and you'll never guess who is the Chief Impact Officer. None other than Prince Harry, the Duke of Suffolk.
I did not notice that.
I said Suffolk. That's funny. Sussex. Yes, I didn't know that either. I was looking it up on their first. They have so many C-suite people. It's very crowded there if they have offices. Anyway, so Better Up Labs, and their mission is they're doing a lot of data analysis on how to make the workplace better. And so that informs a lot of the book, as well as integration with positive psychology. So I can. What do you think, Nick? Should we just dive in or provide a quick summary? What's best?
Yeah, I think a quick summary. After that, I might back up, give people a little bit of context on positive psychology, perhaps, and then we can delve in.
Yeah,
how's that sound?
great. Yeah. So, okay, again, what the book is trying to do is really kind of assess where things are in the working world. They actually have an evolutionary perspective there. They literally go back to us as hunter-gatherers through the farming revolution to the industrial revolution to where we are now. But really, they use this PRISM framework, and I'm just going to read this out. That's the easiest thing to do. This PRISM acronym, which outlines 5 essential skills to thrive in today's workplace. It's called Prospection, which is the ability to envision and plan for future possibilities. Resilience, bouncing back and growing stronger from setbacks. Innovation, so that's, the Prospection is P, resilience is R, innovation, that's I, obviously. Nurturing creativity and problem solving. Social connection, that's yes, that's building rapid rapport even across differences. And then mattering or meaning, that's the M. Cultivating a sense of purpose and impact. I talked about the evolutionary contact. They kind of say how we were meant to be hunter-gatherers, and we've kind of lost that through various revolutions and how we sustain ourselves, farming, industrial revolution, and even today. They're trying to how do we get back to this hunter-gatherer mentality? That's kind of how we're wired. And then they do, talk about resilience, building connection. Then they go through really PRISM and acronym, and at the end, practical tools and exercises on implementing this PRISM framework to really reawaken and strengthen this hunter-gatherer mentality. So that's a perhaps all too brief summary of the book. But Nick, before we get going, I know you wanted to kind of take the reins here, but you chose this book.
Yeah.
So why?
Well, I think, from my perspective, I'm often thinking about thriving and flourishing. Martin Seligman is really the progenitor of this as a coherent movement in psychology. So seeing his name attached to this, the word resilience is really important, and a treatment of that. There's some controversy around the concept of resilience is not, frankly, discussed very much. So I wanted to see how they address that. Creativity. in connection, big ideas in the contemporary world. And I'm looking at this in part through the lens of my work with students, but students are really focused on career and work. So if I can help students see how to flourish here as a basis for how to flourish in the future in their work, I think that helps to be more compelling. So, and that's not something I'm an expert in. So I wanted to get a sense, well, how is work thriving different? How is it similar? How might I use those understandings to appeal to students? And then learn some new things. I must say also, just the title was really cool. TomorrowMind, I kind of love it, to be frank. And so I think it was referenced in something else that I'd read. And so that treatment was positive, at least it was very brief. So I didn't know a lot about it. So those are the main reasons. You know, these words resonate in our work. Resilience, creativity, connection to other people, connection to oneself. So I thought I'd get some useful things out of it, and also might see some gaps. And I think both of those things happen, frankly.
Okay, cool. Well, you wanted to kind of step back and talk about positive psychology for a while. And in there, I would love to hear more about the controversy over resilience. I don't know if that can be an add-on to that.
Yeah, and there's a chapter on resilience, anti-fragility. They connect that with cognitive flexibility or cognitive adaptability, big concepts in my work. So I can say it's a little about resilience, and then maybe we'll come back to it for a deeper treatment, and then I can talk about positive psychology. And the critique of resilience might be reflective of a critique of sometimes of positive psychology. So one critique of resilience is, and they address this, resilience is usually thought of as an individual quality. So it's cultivating the capacity of an individual to bounce back in the face of difficulty, to perform well, to function well, despite not only stress, but distress, difficult circumstances, and then be able to transform that or operate well despite these difficult conditions. So one critique is that cultivating that or emphasizing that to individuals takes whatever social context, organization, institution, or society off the hook. You're just saying, hey, get more resilient, rather than, and so the attention is on the individual and putting the onus of response to these difficulties on the individual rather than the collective. And this provides an advantage to people who benefit from the collective, whether that be a corporation. So if you say to someone who's working under difficult circumstances, be more resilient, the argument goes that this then would take attention away from making the conditions of work more humane, more conducive to growth and development, and that not doing so would benefit the corporation because people then work more and different things, and is to the detriment, or certainly can be the detriment of the workers, the individual, particularly if they're not resilient, is what I would say, right? So, or if they're overwhelmed, they're resilient, but they're overwhelmed. So that's one critique. I've heard some students at Princeton say they don't really like this because it also explains their individual achievements in terms of them as individuals rather than communities and supports. And again, it takes the focus off the group level analysis, the social or interpersonal, and puts it on the individual. And to some extent, I agree with that, in that the challenge of our times is to I think conceptually in the human sciences, is to reconcile the relationship of the individual to the group. Recognize the power of social influences, socialization, conditioning, enculturation, that organizations, bureaucracies, institutions are really powerful, but the institution still has agency. And that's a critique of hyper individualism. But what I see is a tendency on the other side to say people are just basically responsive to their environments and they don't have much agency. It's a strange, in my opinion, reduction of people's agency in the service of individual people. Like if you reduce their agency already, it seems to me that this is dehumanizing them, but also a kind of simplistic behaviorism. We just respond to our environments. We just react to our environments. There's no response. So that's both the critique and then my critique of that critique. And I think positive psychology can be critiqued in that way. But so what is positive psychology? It's not positive thinking. Some people think that, or self-help. Though those things can be related. I have no problem with self-help. Some people have it bad, negative associations. But positive psychology is emerged as a subfield in psychology in the 80s and 90s and thereafter. And I put my mentor at Berkeley, Marty Covington, in that, was thinking about kind of optimal performance. So previously, psychology had focused on people who are in distress. So when I was in undergrad, we had a class in abnormal psychology. We never had one in optimal psychology, right? That would be positive psychology. We had one in abnormal. And so the goal was like a pathological model, like medicine. Hey, what's wrong with you? Let's get you to okay. So historically, that's Western medicine, and psychology, even though they tried to identify distinctive psychological model, was really focused on that. So psychiatry, how do you get people so they're not in psych hospitals, so they're not neurotic, right? To use those words back to Freud, so that they can have reasonable relationships, that they're not coming back from the war and have shell shock and can't function in society. So it's getting them to that modicum of functionality. Now, if you've heard of Abraham Maslow or some others, that goes back to even to the 30s, but prominent in the 50s, was, yeah, but wait a second, what about self-actualization? What's the possibility of being human? What does, I don't know if the word was used, flourishing and thriving look like? How do we cultivate that? Where does that come from? Most of those treatments, though, were not particularly empirical. So positive psychology wedded these aspirations and this interest in optimal performance, the outliers, the people who are doing the best despite these difficult circumstances or way better than everybody else, but also with the advent of new methodologies and cognitive and social psychology could study that in new ways, particularly in empirical ways. And that appealed, of course, to the professional scientific psychology of the time, that was emerging in the 60s, 70s, and into today. And so again, the focus is on how do you thrive? What goes into that? How do people who particularly excel at something and are performing particularly well, how do they do that? So there's a recognition of individual differences, as well as, and this is where I think the book, and I'll stop after this, how do we create conditions in schools, in corporations, and institutions? Marty Seligman works in the military. Has done a lot of work to how to create conditions for soldiers to flourish.
Yeah. So I just want to say, like, when you say empirically driven, it's really data driven. Like these is the surveys and the, just so it's in that way, it's more scientific. I hate to use that term, but perceived at least as more scientific, which was interesting. I think that's what we, in our discussions that we've seen, and was really interesting for me to. It's something you said before, and it's something I really kind of hit home when reading this book was, yeah, this is really data driven. Kind of, here are the end results. We see that here are the conditions by which someone will thrive more at work. And in a way, it's just that. And I think we were both lamenting the fact that there's like, well, okay, there's that, but why is that the case? Like, so there are these conditions, but is that in itself enough to say why? And I would say, well, there's kind of like, why do those conditions in themselves tend to foster what we would call a thriving or flourishing? So I don't know, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that one word that came to mind as you're describing, I think, which is a limitation, maybe conceptually or theoretically, is it's a bit of a mechanistic description. And I think our position is human beings are not machines. Fundamentally, we have agency in ways that machines don't. Even AI doesn't have, and we have to account for that. And it's not just that we're not machines; we have particular features of human beings. We're different than animals in all kinds of ways. For instance, around meaning and purpose. And this is acknowledged, but I'm not. It seems somehow that it's not that the frameworks and the studies are not driven by a big theory like that, at least explicitly, and that the data are sort of thought to stand on them by themselves. And this is the outcome, so do it. I think our approach in the Vogue Academy and our discussions relies on a deep understanding. How do humans work? I think in your terminology, it's the anthropology, and that this is crucial for the individual to know these things so that they can use that knowledge to implement for their own change, growth, development, flourishing. And I think that's it sounds like we both didn't find it in the book. So I'm not thinking it's just me doing a bad reading.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, no. I mean, so in a way, like, I always want to say, like, it's not like we disagree with the findings themselves. And in fact, especially on the discussion of creativity, a lot of their recommendations align with what will be said in our course on creative problem solving. But the question is, how did they get, they just said, well, people who tend to be creative do this, this, and this. And that was it. Because that was what the data showed. And like, that's fine, that's great. But for us, in particular, we took a different route, which was to say, okay, let's understand what's going on in human nature and those, the true nature of discovery. And with that, sorry, do you want to, was that a aha, like, or a yes? Okay.
True nature of discovery. So both the understanding of human beings, but what is this phenomenon we're talking about from a deep perspective? Continue, sorry.
Oh, no problem. So Nick, you might not have seen the screen. Nick went like this, and I was like, okay, did you want to say something, or you were affirming what I said? Uh-oh. Okay, we had a little flip there. Sorry. I think, just so folks know who are watching, it's quite hot here, and I don't know if my internet's been a little spotty.
A little bit.
My
really apologies then.
Yeah. So anyway, so I'll just go to the section on creativity, because I know you wanted to ask about this, but what's interesting, so a lot of the findings, again, they say, you should wander, don't be so rigid in your schedule, have time for your brain to just ruminate.
Default mode network.
Yeah, default mode, right. So which is great, and we actually suggest that as well. But the question is, well, why is that important? They never really addressed that. They just said, well, people who are creative tend to do this, so you should do that as well. Whereas for us, we explored as we said, the nature of discovery, and really used the theory of a scientist turned philosopher named Michael Polanyi, and this idea of the tacit dimension. And for him, that was the way in which we create meaning. And we give he gives a lot of examples. We give examples in our course. The one I use is learning to drive a car, where, initially when you get in, you're overwhelmed, you're for all these sensory inputs, all the sound, the vibrations you're feeling in the steering wheel, in the seat, and everything. And they're just kind of random. And it's it can be a frightening, anxious experience, right, when you're learning to drive a car. But after a while, all that sensory input is ordered or coordinated into a meaningful experience. You're like, oh, I just ran over a pothole, and I could feel it in the front right side of the car. So you're still feeling, there's nothing different in terms of what you're getting from your sensor input. It's just that you've somehow wove that into a meaningful experience, and that is the tacit dimension at work. It is the way by which we create meaning. Thus we are meaning makers. And so for the tacit dimension work in sticky problems, you actually have to let that issue go away. Sometimes we tend to fixate on problems, like, we can't let go because we want to control it, want to control the outcome. And for Polanyi, you had to let that go, and then that allows the issue to go down to the tacit dimension, where it can be, a new meaning or a new order of meaning can be created. And so thus, to let it go is a way to mind wander, or, so there's a theory of the understanding of human nature and anthropology that leads to practical recommendation or a skill or strategy to become more creative versus just the data driven. So it's nice that they align, but it's nice to have the theory to understand why this strategy could work, and specifically, is it something that I need to, instead of just saying, well, I got to do it because the data says I should, it's well, understanding who I am as an individual, as a human being, this is perhaps where I struggle, and so I need to, that's a strategy I need to implement. So that's kind of yeah. So that's one example of how having a really coherent and comprehensive anthropology is really important in this context.
That was the point I was just going to kind of say, actually. So I think we're interested in change, behavior change, and much of that will be relying on the individual. And I think our understanding of human beings is that your view of yourself, the world, shapes your willingness, your dedication to make these changes. Is it possible? How would I do it? So simply following a recipe tends not to work very well, I think for a variety of reasons. But one is if it's not meaningful to us, and I think coherent and cohesive is another way of saying meaningful. Actually, it is. In literacy, the study of text, actually, those are the two defining features of meaning: coherence and cohesion of text, anyways. So if it's not meaningful to us, are we really going to act on it and work hard and take risks and sacrifice to change to things that aren't meaningful? That seems unlikely. So that brings us then, and you alluded to meaning a couple of times. And so that was another question I had is, so you think a lot about creativity, you develop this course, you bring a lens of meaning, purpose, and fulfillment, which I don't know is the word that they used. I think you used that word, right? Fulfillment. What is your, but there's a chapter in the book on meaning, purpose. It's what's an element of the PRISM framework, basically. What is your take on their treatment of this big and important topic?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's I think everyone wants to kind of externalize meaning and try to find it within their context. Like, I got to find meaning in my work, or I need to be doing work that is meaningful, that is impactful. That's great. But I think, and I'm not saying they necessarily do this, but that's putting a lot of eggs in one basket, because, coming out of college, your first job might be, who knows, or if it's going to be, it's going to meet that criterion, or there's plenty of jobs that need to be done and may not have the impact, or it might be hard for you to find that impact. I mean, I just remember my first job out of college, I worked for an options trading company. I know I've probably told you this story. And I was struggling with that because I'm here on the floor of one of the exchanges in New York City, and it's options trading, it's crazy, and things are going on. I'm sitting there, I'm like, the whole time, like, what is going on here? Like, what benefit we provide society? I mean, it was a struggle. So it's not to say you need to. It's a bad question to ask, and yeah, we long for that. We want to have most of us want to have do good for society and help us, and I think that's great. But I was in this job, and I'm like, and I remember in my first midterm review, with my supervisors, and I sat there. I was like, "Can you help me? I'm struggling. Like, what benefit do we provide for society?" And one of my supervisors was like, "Oh, we provide liquidity to the marketplace." And at the time, like, on outside, I was like, "Oh, wow, that's really great. Thank you so much." Inside, I'm like, "What? Like, liquidity to the marketplace? Is that something we're all struggling? Like, oh, is there enough liquidity in the marketplace? Thank goodness there's Matt Frawley on the floor, man." But so I think that is a valid concern, but if it's essential or it has to be there, then I think we're setting ourselves up for a lot of struggle. So I'm not necessarily saying they're saying that, but I just want, I think that could be a tendency. Like, unless my work in the organization I'm working for is doing something super duper impactful and good for society, I'm out. Now, with that said, I know when I led a creative agency, we did not want to work with certain organizations. Like, if you were producing, vaping apparatus, whatever it's called, pens or whatever, no thanks. We weren't going to work with you. So I think there is so again, it's a valid question, but can meaning be found in jobs that are not, so seemingly great for society, but yet, need to be done? And then the question is, do you have, as a human being, do you have to have that in itself? Like, does the work do you need that measure? And this is, again, we are meaning making and meaning craving beings. And so the very fact that they're asking about meaning is fantastic, so that's great. Where we find it and how we find it are really important questions. So I'm glad that they're bringing up that issue, and that, yes, it'd be great if you can find it in your work, but that's elusive, can be elusive. Can you find it in the actual work you're doing? So let's say the organization, maybe not, you can't, it's not providing the most benefit to society, but your particular work is very meaningful. That could be, but then what if that's not there? What, are there other ways of finding meaning that can benefit you and help you? I don't know, it's kind of elusive. I mean, ultimately, my Kierkegaard and contemplative Christian frameworks start to kick in, and so I'm always a bit hesitant to impose that, because there's the sense in which meaning that is contextual or temporal or elusive in a way, they can create anxiety, because deep down I think that they're contingent. And so that's where the need for constancy, and, like, I would even say eternal, like something that's unchanging, that's where we find meaning. But can we find it in our temporal contingent lives?
Yeah. Yes, that's a point of just at a high level where Buddhism and Kierkegaard converge, right? Seeking the constant, the steady, the source of meaning, but more and a more quotidian response, and maybe more mundane. So I think, one of the ways we're talking about it is we talk sometimes finding meaning and making meaning. So I work a lot with students, and they're thinking about their careers, and I often tell them a story, which I'll tell you in a moment. But also that every job has something that's mundane, that doesn't itself seem very meaningful, I think. I've worked hard to try to minimize those, or at least create a balance where I have enough meaning relative to the things that don't seem particularly meaningful. And there's a term for kind of that's called job crafting, which I think is a useful concept. But this distinction between meaning making. So you said we're humans are, I love this phrase. I never heard you say this: meaning craving and meaning making, or, and beings. And I think we can make, so one thing I kind of rethought is, like, we can make meaning in our careers, our jobs, by finding an organization, right, that does things that align with our values, that is meaningful. And then there's another way which we can make meaning by how we approach, conceptualize, think about, invest in the acts of my job. That might be emphasizes more the making of. Right. Now, we can also certainly work in an organization that aligns with values and go through it, kind of get burnt out or be on autopilot. And it's not meaningful, actually, because I'd say because of the human agency, that how we do it. Does that make sense? So one example I'll often tell students, and I believe this, it's not what we do, it's how we do it. And so an example, so I feel like the kind of work I do, especially with students, is ample opportunities to make meaning for me, and be fulfilled. And if I'm attentive and aware and in the moment, that will largely happen. And if I have my purpose and I relate to students and really, if we're working on things that matter to them, then they'll be meaningful for them and me. Now, there's paperwork I have to do and sign people up for stuff, and it's literally my least favorite part of the job. But I'm reminded at my previous employer at Berkeley, there was we had it was a bigger entity. We had a little office that handled the paperwork for students. This is old days, people had actual paperwork, and they would have to, the students that I hired would actually have to go to this little office in our building and go through the paperwork with somebody. This was named Paul. And Paul's job, so he worked in the kind of bookkeeping office, and that's what he did. And he did that for literally hundreds of student employees and managed that paper. You might think it's the most boring job ever. I cannot tell you how many people who I hired, I said, okay, you got to go to the office, came back and said, who is Paul? Who is this guy?
Mm-hmm.
They had this meaningful interaction in this utterly mundane transaction. His humanity, his listening, his interaction, and more than half came back and said, oh my God. And I've said other people probably thought it too. And I had these experiences with him while he was doing my paperwork. And so I've always kept that in mind. Now, that's a lot of intentionality on his part, a lot of energy and effort, but it was kind of also easeful, if that's a word. And so the main point is it teaches me it's how you do it, right? We've kind of all had that, I think, these rare interactions when we're buying a sandwich or at the check-in counter at something, and there's something happens in that interaction that's seemingly out of the ordinary, right? By how that person interacts with you. And that's just a little glimpse, like how do we bring that intentionality, that seeking of meaning and purpose? I think a lot of it does have to do with a word we haven't talked about much yet, which is connection to other people, and creativity, and also the resilience. Like, how do I deal with the mundaneness of my work? And I think, so that aspect of the job career isn't talked about a lot here. And I see that as your question to your boss is looking for fuel for how to make your work have that quality for you.
Right. So how would you, I'm curious, so there's Paul, like this guy, there's Paul, right? And in the mundane, which a lot of us just want to avoid like the plague, he was thriving in that and creating a really rich experience for himself and for other people. And so, you talked about intentionality and whatnot in the mundane, but what does that mean? What does that mean? Like, what are you finding in the mundane? Like, it's seemingly tedious, onerous, just there's part of us that just is repulsed by that. And we want to avoid it. I know that's for myself, right? And I have activities that I find inherently and easily, I'll put it that way, because it's just like, I just love doing them. I can dive into Kierkegaard and I'm gone, and which I know I'm probably like 4 people in the world who are like that, but and other activities. So what does it mean, like, to say, well, you got to be more intentional and finding meaning or whatever? What does that mean to you? Does that make sense? Because it's like, it's another, like, I don't want to be like, just find meaning, because what kind of meaning? What about the activity? Does it have to be the richness of the experience I'm creating for others, or is it just up to us to figure out something that works? What would you say?
That's a good question. I mean, I think many times over the years, so this brings me to many times over the years, I'm going to give probably still a largely psychological science response. And I find often then you come back with much more of a philosophical response, which I think is good. That's why we go together. Yeah. But I would say that I think, so one interpretation, one explanation, if I get a little more specific and concrete, but hopefully not mechanistic. So if I'm more precise, and I would say, well, intentionality is part of meaning making, that I can exert my agency. I sense to have some sort of control and choice, and that is something that brings meaning. So in this case, something like significance or salience, it meets a need in me. Humans want to be autonomous at our core. And so if the act of being intentional is an expression of autonomy, given the nature of the work, too, if I simply process the paperwork, not only would I not have autonomy and be largely an autopilot, which means not intentional, there's some possibilities in that interaction that I would not realize. Namely, like there's an actual human being on the other side of the table from me. We can have an interaction. Humans need this. We need connection, belonging, right? Affinity. But that has to be made. We're not, because we're in the same space doesn't mean we feel connection. That has to be created. And so the intentionality is crucial for that, because I'm consciously or unconsciously or unaware thinking, well, how do I connect with this person? And sometimes it's not obvious answers to that, one of which is to be calm, quiet, immersive listening to someone. It seems like the opposite of making a connection, right? I'm not doing anything, supposedly. So I'd say that. So that's another feature. I think they use the word salience. I might use the word significance, or they meaning the authors of the book. Salience, significance. I connect this to something outside the interaction, right? So I feel I can confidently say Paul was committed to the mission of the organization in which he was working. I assume, we never talked about it, but I assume he saw that piece, and he's right, essential to the achievement of that mission. If we don't have the staff, if they're put off by this, if we can't get them hired, then they can't do the work, then we don't function. We can't be the impactful on the students. We can't be transformative. We can't affect their lives. We can't affect if they're in college to uplift their community, not only for the staff, but for the others, the machine, it breaks down. We can't do it without that. Or more positively, that's an essential component of this process. So I think that would be something like salient significance. But notice this is a effortful act to contextualize what we're doing in this way. So effortful act, that sounds like psychology. Right? So what do you think about that from your vantage point? What am I missing in my explanation?
Oh, no, I mean, yeah, I think I have been thinking about this a lot. And again, it's, from our contemplative Christian and Kierkegaardian perspective, because Kierkegaard was actually fascinated by this, because he's like, we live 99.9% of our lives in the mundane. And that's why we're often not there or not present to ourselves, because it is mundane, and it's seeming, it doesn't have the richness or the meaning that we want. And so we're off somewhere else, either the future, fantasizing about something, or a lot of times that takes the form of, oh, if only I could change this, or get a better job, or better boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse, house, live somewhere else, vacation, all these things that somehow are going to make my life a little bit better, a little richer. Or we're in the past, we're kind of grappling with guilt of some sort, which we can change. So we're never really present in the present, but yet that's all we have. And so he was very fascinated by that, and also was given that a lot of life is mundane, how do you find meaning and purpose, fulfillment in the mundane? So now again, he would say that, well, a lot of Kierkegaard scholars would be like, well, as long as you embrace the present and fully commit yourself to it, and find, like very with passion, just, every choice is made with passion. That's kind of this, to me, just very distorted Kierkegaardian view, like you know, if you're going to be a mountain climber, you just do it with utter passion and, you know, full commitment. That's, you know, that's Kierkegaard, right? Everything's these passionate choices. And I'm like, that is just not Kierkegaard at all. That's I think I mentioned last week how, you know, he had these two sets of writings, the pseudonymous writings and then the Christian, you know, this religious writing, Christian writing. And in that, you know, he was grappling where the mystics were. And I'm not really, you know, he was somewhat aware of the mystical tradition. I'm not sure how much. I mean, there's been some writing on that, but for them, especially there's a mystic called Brother Lawrence, who was have I mentioned it before?
Yeah, to me, not on the
Yeah. No. So he was a
discussion.
really interesting guy. He early 17th century. He fought in the 30 Years' War, was prisoner of war. Then he worked as a valet for some aristocrat, and then joined, I think it was Carmelite monastery, I'm pretty sure, and was never a monk. He was a lay brother. He worked in the kitchens, and then when he was too old to do that, he would repair sandals. And yet, so, you know, he was working pretty mundane jobs, and yet for him, you know, everything he did was finding the presence of God, and that alone was where he found meaning. So he could be doing the most trivial of tasks, and that was perfectly fine. That because he didn't have to find the meaning in the work itself; it was just the presence of God in that work. So there was something unchanging, eternal, because that was always available to him. And even when he was asked to do tasks that he was in no way qualified for, like he talks about how they asked him to take care of the wine order for the monastery. So he had to get on a barge, go down, negotiate, do all the numbers. And he was kind of an oaf, really, by his own admission. He had no talent for this, but he's like, all right, I'll do it. You know, like, because he didn't have to worry about the consequences or whatever, because he's like, I'm just going to do the best job I can. Presence of God is there. There we go. So I kind of have that framework in mind, which is, you know, my framework. And it's not like listeners are going to embrace contemplative Christianity or Kierkegaard. And so so I'm always struggling with, how do you help people who aren't there? And so part of me, this is where I get back to kind of the deep like self-awareness and understanding who you are, for meaning, like, and just being intentional. Like a lot of for me, and this is where I'm just getting back to what I was been thinking about lately, is self-assertion. Like, in a way, we're always asserting ourselves to kind of and controlling a situation for our own needs. You know, part of that is for meaning making, but, you know, it's to say, you know, I have meaning, I have purpose, I have value. You know, that's I mean, there's getting meaning, but there's also this sense of, I need to somehow, in this chaotic world that is often indifferent to me, assert that I have value to myself. You know, so that's the philosophical driver, or existential, you know, driver. So that's what we're about. And so how do you do that in a constructive way for yourself and for others? You know,
I mean, I think so much of what you're saying, first of all, so much you're saying converges with my understanding of certain kinds of Buddhism. But that last point, I think, points to what's missing here. So you said, I have value to myself, my self-relationality as a crucial, not only as a source of motivation, which self-worth theory grasps. Self is a powerful prime motivator. Most theorists of motivation don't really talk about that. It's omitted. And they do talk about some of the other things, other kinds of motivation, like being important in a community, having an impact. These are real, but I think our framework is that one way to understand that is there's still an underlying relation to self that can and often does motivate these other layers of motivations and needs and drives. Does that make sense? And Like
Well,
a lot of treat.
I would clarify and just say it always is influencing the other one. It's not like it's
Right.
not intermittent, because that self-relationality is utterly constant. It's always going, even when you're consciously not aware of it. So it impacts, informs every single decision, every thought that we have. And yet, what's, to your point, what's startling almost is how neglected it is in the writings, even like, in TomorrowMind and other books of
Right.
its ilk. It's not even discussed, and yet that's fundamental to who we are as a human being. Sorry, I didn't.
Yes, no, it's great. I think so. One of the contributions of self-worth theory, which is a broad paradigm in psychology that's widely used, I'm not so sure it's fully understood. And then self-worth theory of motivation, that's is what I've trained in, does add this. So I was trying to be ecumenical in saying, okay, I'm for my brethren, if you will, who study motivation, I'm not going to make the claim that for right now, for that purpose of that sentence, this is the prime motivator, although a self-worth theory does assert that. But that there's some relationship between these different kinds of motivations. And I think you would acknowledge that too, right? There's different kinds of motivations and needs. But I think it's more than a motivation in your framework, right? And in fact, it's like psychology, and this is coming from psychology, kind of doesn't have words and language for some of these other things, right? We might call them needs and drives. That might fit the bill for you. There's something else. And I think that's what I've learned over the years from talking to you. There's psychology isn't actually very good at talking about meaning. Actually, I knew that before talking to you, but then what does that point to as its gaps? What's missing? So I'm an empiricist for sure. I've spent a lot of time reading and studying psychology, and I value what it has, but I also am aware of what it doesn't. And one of the things I think it doesn't is some of the things we're talking about: relationship to self, the significance of the sense of self in all of our choices. And so that I think that is reflected, for instance, in psychotherapy, the Carl Rogers sense of self. Now, Buddhism would even put that in question and say, so I think contemporary psychology says, how do you have a healthy sense of self? Buddhism says, how do you get rid of your sense of self? Very different responses. So a lot of your anxiety, stress, as you said, regret, shame, fears, they're in relation to our sense of self. So one way to address that is have a better sense of self, more self-esteem, self-worth. Another is to say, what is this thing called self? Why is it so important to me? Where does that come from? Is that the best way to look at the world, through my sense of myself? Is that the best way? And there's clues even in our language that it's not. We're selfless. We lose ourselves in our activities. Those are often ideal states. So maybe even our colloquial language point us toward decentering the self, de-emphasizing oneself. Now, how to do that then is really, really difficult, I think.
Oh, no, I totally agree. And this is where my mentor, James Loder, really was key. And, I wish he was studied more. I remember reading a book, I think it's called The Reciprocal Self. It's by a group of psychologists, but Christian psychologists. And what's interesting is they're one of the few books who actually acknowledge Loder's work, but they just said, oh, he was someone trying to grapple with the relationship between theology and psychology or something like that. I mean, but that level, but they didn't really see that his work was a critique of what they were doing. Because, for Loder, this idea of the void of nothingness is what we fear at the core of our being. And now that gets into Christian, the idea of being separated from God, and being, that we are separated from God, who is considered life and meaning, like that's where we're supposed to find meaning, is in relationship with God. All that aside, there's this, there's a sense of the void or nothingness that, according to Loder, we experience right from birth onwards. And so he makes this claim that that normal psychology is or normal ego development is inherently maladaptive because it's grappling with this nothingness. It weaves it into it. So this idea of like protecting the self and self-assertion are ways of pushing back the void and nothingness, and that's inherently maladaptive. But yet it's the core of how we tend to go about doing psychology. So the idea of like the Buddhist idea of like, how do you let go of the self, or in flow, when that self kind of dissolves into this really incredible state of just being, where things are just, you're just going, it's great. We all, flow is this amazing state. But it goes into this idea that, like to Loder, like that was so fundamental, was, for him, it was, this idea of in Christianity of dying to yourself. Because that needed to happen in order to come back into this relationship with God. And that's what he focused on. But anyway, to your point, again, we'll see the alignment between kind of mystical contemplative Christianity and Buddhism and Loder's work and Kierkegaard, this, the distortions of ourselves when we're so self-protective of ourselves. But that leads to the first step, which we're trying to say is like, you have to be aware of that. You have to come to the key of self-awareness, because without that, you're not aware of these internal dynamics. And then you can read a book like TomorrowMind. I just need to do this, 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 and this. Everything's going to be great. And then you find out it doesn't quite work. Things are still not so amazing. And then you tend to blame yourself, which is another self-protective measure. Tragic though it be, like you're something that's wrong with me is a conclusion that somehow, it might be right to say it's self-protective, but it's just building these walls that are just beating yourself up and whatnot, that are, just.
Well, I don't know if this is where you're going. I had never thought of this. So let me try.
I'm not even sure where I'm going. So there you go.
So I thought, self-protective, because it protects you against the fear of the void. Because you say, well, it's not this explanation. There's an explanation. There's a thing I can do. It's just me. And in some ways that's more painful, but in some ways it's relative to the, hey, there is no answer, or there's this nothingness that you're avoiding. That's scarier even than feeling terrible about yourself.
Yeah, no, that's actually, I had never put that together, but I think that's absolutely right. Like,
well, I thought that's what I heard you saying. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think I was getting there, and I probably, but no, this is why I love working with you, because we help each other out. But yeah, I think you're right. By saying, "Oh, it's my fault," that still allows the possibility that there can be a solution or something. Versus, no, it's just, there's nothing out there. It's utter indifference, and it's just the void. Yeah. We cannot allow that in the end to be, for ourselves and for the world. We just need that sense of meaning. It's got to be somewhere, even if we're the ones at fault for not finding it.
Right. Well, it's interesting when you say it's my fault. That puts myself at the center.
Yeah.
Gives me responsibility. Now, I don't like the consequence, but it still centers me relative to maybe there's another explanation that's scarier, more frightening, and then, or suggests a path that I can't really understand, at least at the moment. And so that could undermine my sense of I can affect something in the world to make me feel better. But there's a lot more to go here. Some cool connections from my point of view. Right. Any final comments, words on the book? How people might use it constructively? How you might use it constructively?
Well, again, a lot of the strategies they recommend are great. We're not necessarily saying this book is bad at all. I mean, we really appreciate the amount of work and the empirical work behind the book is great. Again, I think we're just saying, there's this kind of why component that's missing in this anthropological depth that we wish that was there, because some of these strategies may not work for you, like in your and and again, the temptation to say, well, it's my fault or whatever. And it's just like, well, no, you're the way you're wired or where you are right now in your life. You may need to emphasize this over that. You might be at a place where you can constructively appropriate that yourself. But that there, because it doesn't have this anthropology, there are these gaps that we've noted, but also ways in which people can be adversely affected by the reading of this book, or their implementation of the strategies that we just want to caution people on. But again, I enjoyed reading it. I really appreciate the work of Seligman and so
Kellerman. Kellerman.
Yeah, that's her name.
Kellerman, yeah. Rosen Kellerman. Yeah.
How about yourself?
Yeah, I think it's a really nice description. There's a lot of usefulness. So it's utility, and they've organized it pretty helpfully. I certainly appreciate the broad thrust. Like you, I think there's something at the core here that isn't examined, and that's not surprising to some extent from empirical psychologists. They don't have tools and frameworks that are very good at getting at that, in my opinion, in general. But just because we don't have tools to look at it doesn't mean it's not important. And so that might we may need to have other ways to access. And then there's a perspective that starts from this core that I think we see some gaps and limitations. But as a pragmatist, as a practical coach, someone who works with people on how to make change in their lives and find fulfillment, there's as you said, a wide and useful toolkit here that I will definitely be using in my coaching.
Cool. Is there a good place to stop, or is there more any other topics you wanted to cover?
I'm good.
You're good. All right. Great. All right. Well, thanks, Nick. Really helpful conversation. Thanks so much for your time and just your thoughts and guidance.
Thank you, Matt. You're the one that really helped me make sense of this text in a constructive way while acknowledging what's missing.
Cool. All right. Until next time.
All right. Thanks a lot.